You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Hannah Richell.
Thanks for tuning in to Author Stories today. We've got a fantastic show lined up for you. Before we get into that, I'd like to tell you about some sponsors today. Crystal Pico Watanabe at Pico's House. The Pico's House website now has a new look. She's got a team of 8 people who help provide services to fiction authors. She has a full slate of services that now include beta reading. She's got 4 beta readers now. So if you're looking for beta reading services, she can definitely take on your project. Manuscript critique, developmental editing, line editing, copy editing, and proofreading. Authors can also inquire about putting their books in her Book Lovers Box, which is a monthly digital subscription box with a different theme each month. It's free to authors for a limited time. Be sure to check out Crystal and her whole team at Pico's House. That's PIKKOSHOUSE.com. Thanks, Crystal, for sponsoring the show. While cape and spandex movies are breaking box office records, comic book commentator and influencer Ed Gosney doesn't want us to forget the roots of these marvelous wonders. His blog, Cool Comics in My Collection at edgosney.com, covers the gamut of 4-color entertainment, from contemporary comic books to comics made for kids to bargain bin gold to classics that will transport you back in time. Comic books are a perfect blend of art and story, and Cool Comics captures the essence of what these funny books mean to us in a personal way. And make sure to join the Cool Comics in My Collection Facebook group, where members can interact, show off their prized comics, and have opportunities to win. You guessed it, Cool Comics. Published weekly, Cool Comics in My Collection aims to bring you a smile and reminds us why comic books are fun. Be sure to visit edgosney.com today. Speaking of superheroes and comics, my friend Patricia Gilliam has a fantastic series called The Heroes of Corvus. It begins with Book 1, a flight between a second-generation superhero named Red Bolt and a villain for hire named Icarus goes terribly wrong, resulting in the drowning deaths of 3 innocent civilians and orphaning a 6-year-old boy. Racked with guilt, Red Bolt visits Cameron Wilson at the hospital every night and won't leave the boy's side until he falls asleep. Befriended by a night shift nurse, the man in costume begins to disclose what really happened after the fight and why he feels the deaths of Cameron's parents and sister fall on his actions. A superhero didn't survive that night, and Cameron and the rest of the city aren't out of danger. This is such a phenomenal story. She has released up to part 4 now, and I cannot wait for part 5 to come out. If you're looking for a great adventure read that's on the cutting edge of what is in today's entertainment, The Heroes of Corvus is the series for you by Patricia Gilliam. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to go to hankgarner.com to subscribe to the show. We're on just about every platform you can imagine. Now stay tuned for our show. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today I'm really excited to have Hannah Richell on the show with me today. She has a fantastic new book. It's called The Peacock Summer, and it will be new to some, but it's been out in hardback for about a year now, and now it's coming out in paperback here in the States, and it's available everywhere. Welcome to the show, Hannah.
Hi, Hank. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm excited to have you today. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
It's such a good question. It's really challenging, isn't it? Because you have to dive back into your history and really sort of work out when that fire was lit. And I think for me, it probably, as well as all the books, obviously, that I'd read and loved through my childhood, there was one moment, I was probably aged about 9, and I was living with my family in Canada at the time, in Calgary, and we were tasked in our school classroom to write a poem about the Winter Olympics. And unbeknown to me, my teacher then submitted my poem to a district school's writing competition. And a few weeks later, she presented me with this anthology with my poem in, which was incredibly exciting for a pretty shy, not very confident 9-year-old. And I think for me, that was a moment where it felt like a little bit of validation for writing. And I just thought, wow, this is something special. Someone has read my words and I think they're all right. But having said that, from the age of 9 up to the age 30 plus, I didn't write. I found my way to books through a publishing career and sort of sat on the other side of the fence working with writers and helping them publish their books. And I think in a way that actually stopped me from creatively exploring my own writing, because I was thinking, well, there's all these amazing writers out there, and you know, I couldn't dare to dream that I would also one day write a book. And it's only then when I fell pregnant with my first child that I actually felt the seeds of something beginning to brew inside of me, and I put pen to paper and started a story which ended up becoming my first published novel.
I love that. Your story, I think, resonates deeply with a lot of people. The idea that, and I like how you said it, you know, it's so hard to look back at when that fire was lit. It is kind of infectious that way when you've been bitten by the storytelling bug. It never leaves you. It's just always there with you, it seems. And life gets in the way, and we go our different directions and different paths. But something about it just nags at you until you come back, doesn't it?
That's right. I mean, I filled diaries as a kid and a teenager, and even actually as a young adult, I kept a diary always. But you know, they were self-indulgent. I just couldn't probably bear to. I've kept them all, but I really don't want to look back at them, to be honest. But that was the only writing I was doing, other than then in my job copywriting. So yeah, I think the power of a good teacher or a little bit of encouragement to a young mind is extraordinary, and that it's not to be sniffed at.
Oh, I say that all the time. I love when people tell a story of an adult that recognized that gift in a kid, because so many days for a writer are dark and lonely, and you know, it's really up to your own self to find the motivation, and some days it's just really, really hard. But that little moment of encouragement that doesn't cost an adult a thing sticks with you and becomes almost legendary in your mind. And I have some kind things that teachers said to me early on, and those things grow, inside you. And I've reconnected with some of those teachers, and, they kind of smile and, say, well, that's wonderful. And they may never remember it, but man, to me, it is everything.
Oh, I completely understand. And I think we need that as adults too. It's easy. As writers, it's such a solitary job, and that sort of crisis of confidence, you have that self-doubt sitting on your shoulders. So it's still nice, isn't it, to have, someone reach out and say, oh, your words touched me, or keep going, or, you're doing all right.
That's right. You worked in publishing and helping other people tell their stories. I'm curious, do you feel like, that you, well, and not that you had one motivation. I don't mean to reduce it to something as simple as that, but do you feel like working in publishing, were you trying to scratch the storytelling itch that you had, so to speak? Was it something that you did in place of writing yourself, or do you feel like it was a stepping stone to help get you back to writing?
I don't think I saw it as a stepping stone. When I left university, I cast around in my mind to think, what could I do? What would I be good at? And I'd done a literature-based degree, so I kind of knew that stories and writing was my passion. And it seemed like a no-brainer, really, to try to get into the publishing industry and to pursue that as my career. So I got very lucky. I worked my way up from the bottom. I started as a PA to somebody, making coffee and typing letters. And then gradually worked my way up through a marketing department to become head of marketing at one of the sort of big publishing houses in London. So I think it wasn't a stepping stone to writing, because at that point I didn't dare to believe that I could be a writer myself. I felt like that was as close as I was going to get, and it was the job that I most wanted to do. And it was a wonderful job. I loved it.
Can you look back and put your finger on any specific things that you learned working in publishing that have helped you as a writer later on?
Yes. So I sat in many editorial meetings where books were brought to the table by editors and publishers who pitched to get the work acquired by the company. And I have to say, there's nothing more sobering looking back on those meetings as a writer now, to sort of see how little time a publisher has to pitch their passion for a book that they might have read and loved, and how hard it is to get everybody in the company engaged and excited. But when that moment happens and everyone's on board, it's really exciting and thrilling to sort of think where you can take that book. But as a writer, that's slightly crippling, because you know too much almost, having been in that side of the business. And I think you have to put all of that to one side and write the story that you want to write in the way that you want to write it, not think about publishing and marketing and book deals or agents. It's purely about the love of the story when you first sit down to write. And then it really is luck, I think, whether your book finds its way to the right publisher who gets it and wants to send your work out wider into the world. But what I learned, I suppose, through that experience is the power of a good pitch and the need to make the opening chapters of a book really hook your reader in. Because often in those meetings, you didn't have long to convince people, or, they might only have half an hour to read the first few pages. So it's important, if you're looking to be published, to consider how you're pitching your work, how you see your work. But I think all of that should come subsequent to the writing, which, the writing should be done purely for the love of story, I think.
Sure. So what was it that brought you back to writing your own stories?
It began, as I mentioned earlier, I was pregnant with my first child. I was having a miserable pregnancy. I was incredibly sick, and I had to leave the job I was working in at the time. And I was at home and had a bit of time on my hands, and I just felt this sort of creative urge welling up in me. And I also had this desire not to sort of let my brain turn to mush while I was at home and not working. And so I just started this story, and the seed of it really came from my own childhood memories of time spent in a coastal area in the UK called Dorset, which is where my grandparents used to live. And I just started to think about the area and a set of characters who might have inhabited it. And the story just grew from there. And it started off really as just a small project to see if I could do some long-form fiction. But as I got more and more invested in it, it just snowballed, and I found I couldn't stop writing. And actually, once my baby was born, I found myself, every time I put him down for a nap, just running back to the laptop so I could keep writing. And that was it, really. I was hooked.
That is amazing. I love it when a story just comes alive and characters take on, a reality of their own. How long did you work on that book?
I probably worked on it for a good couple of years. And I went back to some work part-time in the meantime, and it was sort of bubbling away as a side project for a while. And then once I felt a bit more confident with it, I gave it to, I think my sister was my first reader, and she gave me some great feedback. So I worked again on it. And then I just felt like I got it to a point where I couldn't see it clearly anymore. And I thought I would take a punt and send it out to some agents and see what happened. And that was when things sort of snowballed quite quickly, and it all got very exciting.
Now, is that the book that would become The Secrets of the Tides?
That's right. And I think in the US it was published as The House of Tides.
House of Tides, right, right. As someone who had worked in publishing, did you recognize the signpost along the way? Like, okay, I've got this book. It's at this point. Now I know that this is the next step. You know, had that time on the inside helped you to bring life to your own book?
A little bit. I think it probably helped me when I was pitching it to agents. I could be quite clear, I think, in where I felt it sat in the market and what sort of comparison authors I might compare it to. But actually, in other ways, it was a little paralyzing to think of putting my words into that huge machine and hoping to get a positive outcome. It seemed, impossible, really, knowing how it worked from the inside. So I submitted it really with very low expectations of what might happen. I thought I might get a little bit of advice, and probably I'd be sent on my way. So yeah, I didn't have high hopes, to be honest.
Well, with all the benefits that come from working in the industry, one thing that you're not allowed to have after that is just dumb luck. I don't know any better, so I'm just gonna, put this out there and I'm just going to assume that it's going to have a life of its own. So that has to be a little terrifying, because you have seen so many stories of people that just don't work out. The book is not right for the time, or it's not the right story, or, and all of that has to kind of hang around in the back of your mind.
That's right. And I think, sort of going back to my point about trying not to write to a market, you can't do that really, because the market shifts and changes so quickly. So that's why it's really important just to write the story you're most invested in, because that's what will produce your best writing. And then, if it fits with what's happening in the publishing world at the time, then that's lucky and wonderful, and you grab it with both hands. But if not, if you've still got the passion there for the writing, then you keep going. But yeah, it's funny. It's, publishing is sort of a bit of luck and a lot of gambling, and, you just got to take the wild ride when it comes.
Right. When a story begins to form in your mind and start to come alive, is it usually a character that you begin with? Is it some emotional point that you're struck by? What's the seed of the story? How does that usually form for you?
It's quite interesting. I think it's been different for each of my novels. But looking at the Peacock Summer, specifically, that idea, I think, came from two sort of touchstone moments. The book's about a grandmother and her relationship with her granddaughter. And before I started writing, my own grandmother passed away. And I think it was her death that really caused me to think about writing about the relationship between a grandmother and her granddaughter, and their sort of generational differences between them, but also the closeness that could exist between two women of such different ages. And the second point for me came about when I stumbled upon a little slice of history, really, that I hadn't known about. There was a wealthy American businessman in the late 1800s in London who hired a really famous artist at the time to come to his townhouse and paint a whole room. And he wanted to show off to his friends, basically. He wanted to invite them around to his house and for everyone to gasp in admiration at his incredibly beautiful dining room. And so the artist came. The artist was James McNeill Whistler, who painted this beautiful room. And then, as history tells it, the two men fell out over what was publicly acknowledged as a spat over money and what the true cost and value of the room was. The secret whisper was that actually the artist had been having an affair with his patron's wife. And it was that tiny detail, where, like a whispered rumour, that captured my imagination and set me off on the path of writing The Peacock Summer, which has a painted room at the heart of the story.
Wow. So as you're kind of mulling over these stories that you've heard or read about, and It's so funny to me that you can read a news article or some little tidbit of history, and the factual story kind of takes a left turn somewhere and becomes this whole other thing. What did you start doing with that idea that when that kernel was placed, and kind of how does it start to grow from there?
Well, it's good. It's a good point, actually. It was very important to me not to just transplant the story and tell that story. I didn't want to do that, obviously. So I just took the idea of the affair and an artist and started to think about a different age. So I set my story in the 1950s and then in the present day. I needed a location. For me in my writing, I find landscape and buildings and houses really important to my storytelling. I often find that a place can tell as powerful a story as a character or a person. So I settled on a location that I wanted to write about, which ended up being the Chiltern Hills in Buckinghamshire in the UK, which is an area that I myself grew up in and sort of spent my childhood years in. And so I think weaving together the idea of my characters and the place and the time, the story just naturally started to sort of percolate. And before I knew it, I was at my computer and writing.
I love that. In the Peacock Summer, you've got a dual timeline going on, and I definitely understand what you're saying about how the place almost becomes a character and begins to inform the way the people react, and how just, it becomes part of the story in the same way that the emotions of the people are. Time can also have that effect, and do you consider time to be almost a character? Does that inform the behaviors of characters and all of that? And kind of what was the idea for the dual timelines in the book?
Yeah, I love playing with time in my writing, and I often find that having that kind of split time frame allows you to play around with themes and images and moods in quite a compelling way. So to offset, a scene that happens in the 1950s, which obviously was a very different age to the present day timeline that's happening with a different character, but to mirror scenes or images, or even to have objects appear from one scene in one time in the present day, can be quite powerful and can sort of enhance a story quite a lot. So it almost becomes like you're writing a puzzle and you're trying to give symbols and signs to the reader that kind of magnify the actual plot and the sort of the nuts and bolts of what you're actually showing. So it's quite fun, I think, to play around with time and definitely to have two different time frames. It's challenging. I mean, I found at one point I actually needed a spreadsheet mapping out the scenes so I didn't get too confused in the actual sort of telling of the story. But then to be able to pick out certain scenes or images and then play with them in a different time it's really fun.
Well, another fun thing to do is with time is to look at a character at different places in their development and in different places in their life, and to especially when you're bringing in other family members. Tell us about Lillian and Maggie and how they factor into the story, please.
Well, Lillian is the grandmother character in the present day that I mentioned earlier, and she is the character that carries the 1950s story thread through. So we meet her both in the 1950s and then in the present day where she's in her 80s, and her granddaughter Maggie is called back to the family home, which is a beautiful manor house in the Chiltern Hills called Cloudesley. Because Lillian is ailing, she's not doing too well. She's had a stint in hospital. She's been released, but she needs full-time care. And so Maggie is called back to look after her. So you get the dynamic between the grandmother and the granddaughter and their shifting relationship and the secrets that they have to share with each other throughout the story. But you also get Lillian as a younger woman, and the stresses and problems and issues that she faced as a married woman in the 1950s, living in this incredible house, but married to a very rigid and oppressive man who is quite controlling and basically takes away a lot of her freedoms. So they're the kind of two main female characters. And yes, you do get to see Lillian at different points in her life, and comparing her as a younger woman to the older woman she becomes I don't know, I found it quite an interesting experience actually to inhabit the character in two different stages of her life. And I was a little worried writing about an older woman. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to connect with her, but I actually found that spending that much time with her and sort of traveling through her life with her, I felt really kind of emotionally connected to her in lots of ways. And lots of the emotions she was feeling, I could really sort of connect to as well. I mean, at the time, she's got this sort of loneliness and solitude about her, which at that point in my life, I could really connect to.
It's so fun when those characters, come alive, for lack of a better word. You're worried about connecting with a character. Well, I don't really know anything about this, and they really take on lives of their own. In the beginning, were there any people, maybe in your family or people that you knew that you kind of used as a reference point to start to try to get in that mindset? To if you don't know anything about a character, what are some things that you do to try to get in that mode?
Well, I do find, weirdly enough, although obviously you're writing, so it's all word-based, I find music and images really helpful in my writing.
Yes.
I actually created a Pinterest board for the Peacock Summer, which I started collating and collecting images and just keeping them on file to kind of review and go back to when I felt like I was losing touch with the mood or the sort of atmosphere or imagery I was trying to create in the book. And there were two images, I think, for Lillian in particular that really struck home for me. And there was one picture of, it was Audrey Hepburn actually in 1955, and she's sitting on a tree, like a fallen tree in a woodland, and she's writing a letter. And she looks really beautiful, but very melancholy. And that image for me was the perfect reference point for Lillian in the 1950s. And then later on, there was another image I found, which was of a granddaughter sitting with an older woman, and the woman looks quite ill and she's lying in bed, and the younger woman at her bedside is reading to her. And it's such an intimate, affecting image, and it really spoke to me of the closeness that I wanted to conjure between the two women. And so I kept that sort of to hand as well as I was writing, just to keep me connected to the emotion that I was trying to convey with my words.
Love that. The title of the book is very evocative. How does the idea, the motif of the peacock figure into the story?
Well, the peacock was something I seized upon straight away, having read that historical episode with James McNeill Whistler. His dining room was covered in peacocks. So the peacock straight away seemed like a great image to use within the book. And in fact, for a long time, my working title was The Peacock Room. But then as I kept writing, it became apparent to me that the peacock was the perfect symbol in so many other ways, and that, we all know that peacocks symbolize beauty and extravagance, and sometimes they symbolize vanity. And there's also that incredible show-stopping moment where the peacock sort of fans out its tail and shows everyone its true beauty. And for me, again, that was like the perfect image for what is essentially a kind of show-stopping moment in the book, where the painted room itself is revealed to the reader and to its audience for the first time. So there were lots of reasons to use the peacock. I mean, peacock feathers, some people believe that they're really unlucky. If you have them in your house, they bring bad luck. So again, that kind of fits with the story in a really neat way.
As your books have really found an audience in your home country and here in the States, does that ever factor in when you're writing that you have a multinational audience? Do you ever worry that some themes or settings or things like that maybe won't translate to readers, or does that come into your mind at all?
Not very much, to be honest. I think
that's good.
Yeah, I think readers these days, I mean, we all read, if you're a book lover, you read widely, you read many different writers from many different backgrounds. And I think, there as readers, you know what you like, but I think I don't think the experience today, we're all so connected that I don't think it really matters. I mean, if you're telling a good story, it doesn't really matter where it's set or what time. I mean, you look at the genre of science fiction and fantasy, well, there's probably nothing more unreachable than that, and yet it doesn't stop people falling in love with it, and it's just another form of amazing escapism. So I don't worry about that, to be honest. And I think books have their readers, and some people, I fully accept some people will read my work and not like it. They won't like my writing style, or the story won't appeal to them, and that's quite right, because we're all different and we all have different tastes.
Yeah. Hannah, at the end of the book, when the reader has finished and we're left with that feeling at the end of the book where, characters that we've grown to love, we have to let them go. And what do you hope readers are left with when they close that back cover of the book?
I would like to think that they'd be left with a sense of emotion, really, that they've invested their time. I mean, I'm obviously honoured for anyone to read to the end of one of my books, but I would want and hope that they might feel that, they've been on a bit of a journey, really, and that the experience of reading the book has left them with a kind of strong emotion. And I hope that emotion would be a kind of warm and an understanding, but I can't, what someone takes from my books, I guess I'm not really responsible for, because everyone's going to bring their own experience to the reading of it. But I'd certainly hope that it would be a warm and happy feeling.
Well, the book, The Peacock Summer, is out everywhere in hardback and paperback when people are hearing this. Also audiobook and Kindle edition. Hannah, is there a place where people can connect with you online if they want to learn more about you and dig into your back catalog and follow along with news that's coming up?
Yes, they can. So I have a blog at hannahrichell.com. I'm also on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram as Hannah Richell. So I'm probably quite easy to track down.
Great. We're going to send everybody to see you and to pick up their copy of The Peacock Summer. Hannah, this has been so much fun talking. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you so much, Hank. It's been fun.
Thanks for tuning in to the Author Stories podcast. Be sure to subscribe at hankgarner.com or on your favorite podcasting app. Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
On Walpurgis night, when the moon is high, hell's bells ring and witches must answer. They dapple their breasts with rendered fat of murdered babes, straddle their brooms, and take to the sky, as the devil wills, to speed through dreamy midnight air to the summit of the Brockenberg, that haunted peak shrouded in swirling mists, where a glen of gnarled limbs and wan moonlight awaits to host their debauches and blasphemies. Now to the Brocken the witches ride. The stubble is gold and the corn is green. There shall the carnival's sabbat be seen, and the devil shall come to preside. The accuser elopes from the bowels of hell, a sure-footed, goat-headed, many-horned beast with cloven hooves and a staff of bone. He perches upon the witch altar to brood in cerulean half-light, a winged silhouette with watchful red eyes. The witches gather and bow to their master. Upon his charred rump give the shameful kiss. Then imps beat the drum and a round dance begins. Lash yourselves into frenzy, hags. Pass the chalice of pure marrow broth. Whip the ground with your hair. Tread the sky with your feet. Dance with joined hands around Satan's cold fire. Then find out a nook of nettles and moss, and lay with the rough-skinned beast of your choosing, suckling some rancid teat of desire. But hist! The cock crows. Away, away! Gather your tatters and broomsticks and wits, back to your huts, to your thresholds and hearths, and become once more, at the red break of day, the furtive adder in your neighbor's garden. The ghost host of the Salem Sorcery Tour, dazzling in his steampunk Victorian morning crepe, let the spell he'd woven trail through the twilight air like a hag across the moon, then chirped, "Isn't that silly?" and bowed, sweeping the wet grass with his satin-ribboned top hat. The tour group gave a polite round of applause. Nobody believes that stuff today, but the Puritans sure did. They took witches very seriously. If they went down in the morning and bought eggs, and one was rotten, surely the devil had come in the night, gone boop, tee-hee-hee, then scampered off on his little hooves. And who's in league with the devil? Witches. We're taught that the Puritans were super nice and cute with little buckles on their hats, but it's not the case, folks. They were fanatics. Witch hunts don't happen in a healthy society. They hated kids. They hated women. They were crazy. And that craziness. He turned on the spot, casting a protective circle around the stone garden of the witch memorial. Got these people killed.